Hey everybody, I'm Tim Mooney. If you're a student of climate change, political science, history, psychology, or the theater, or if you just want to understand any of these a little better, you'll want to stick around to hear how you can finally get climate change, Part 5. Today I'm working my play, Man Cave, a one-man sci-fi climate change tragic comedy, back into performance shape, and that gives me a chance to think about the many issues that weave their way through this play. I'll be performing this show this Sunday and Monday, April 11th and 12th, 2021, at 8 p.m. on Facebook and Zoom. I do a wide variety of 10 different shows on alternate Sundays and Mondays, at least until the pandemic lightens up. If you get something out of this, please light up that like button or smash on subscribe or ring the bell. And if you'd like to see my first take on I Finally Get Climate Change, you can follow this link. So, here we go with I Finally Get Climate Change, Part 5. This episode's going to be a little different, a little more personal, and it's going to need to touch on politics. Fortunately, as I'm addressing you here in April of 2021, we don't have any major elections underway. So, I can talk about politics without directly commenting on any particular candidate or election. Conveniently, though, you may be thinking a little more about the U.S. tax code over the course of the coming week. We here at the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater are a not-for-profit institution, but we can discuss politics as a subject, especially as we work to inspire, inform, enlighten, educate, and entertain. So, with that caveat in place, I want to take a somewhat personal journey through our political landscape through the course of my lifetime, questioning where we as a country and as a species have been and are heading as we face down the menace of climate change. Back at the turn of the 20th century, we were emerging from a period known as the Gilded Age. The railroads were becoming a massive power, and there was a growing disparity between those on the top and the bottom and middle. The wealthiest 10% of American households owned more than 3/4 of the nation's wealth. That era was as famous for its robber barons, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Guggenheims, and Vanderbilts, as we are for our own modern-day equivalents, the Bezoses, the Musks, the Waltons, and the Gateses. These things tend to swing on a pendulum, and the disparity in wealth stirred a drive towards unionization. When the economy collapsed, Franklin Roosevelt introduced massive jobs programs that focused on the infrastructure, utilities, electrical systems, transportation, communications. The introduction of Social Security made it possible for the vast majority of senior citizens to not spend their final years in abject poverty and starvation. I'm way oversimplifying this, but over the course of 3 decades, the economy came roaring back. Of course, even more shared effort and shared sacrifice were demanded to win out over the great existential threat of World War II. Following the war, the GI Bill enabled a vast swath of the American people to afford a college education which expanded the middle class as never before. These efforts worked from the assumption that what was good for the people as a whole was also good for the greatest mass of individuals. We worked together, we survived together, we grew strong together. We didn't live as individual islands of prosperity. We were surrounded by a sea of prosperity. This is about where I come in. I'm a little older than I look. The year I was born, 1959, the top U.S. marginal tax rate was 91%. The top marginal tax rate had been above 90% for 15 years, since 1943, and the U.S. economy was thriving better than ever. When people talk about the good old days, they are generally talking about the 1950s. Yes, racism, sexism, very much a problem, but I became alive at right about the very climax of an unprecedented string of successes and a vigorous middle class. But then, August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident. No U.S. casualties, but a single bullet hole in the USS Maddox, and reports of radar images of torpedo boats drives the U.S. into the Viet Nam War, which eventually kills 58,000 young Americans, mostly men, and over 1 million from the collective nations involved. Decades later, the reports of all those torpedo boats ready to attack the USS Maddox are revealed as imaginary. You can look it up. This was the great divisive event of my childhood. Young men were forced to register for the Selective Service Draft. My childhood awareness of the personal impact of political choices awakened under the looming threat of a war in which I could not imagine myself fighting. My 5-year-old self didn't know that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was a false flag. I just had no interest in killing people or dying in an unknown land where our interest was vaguely strategic at best. Oddly enough, it was also in 1964 that the top marginal tax rate dropped below 90% for the first time in over 20 years. These two things, national service and taxation, seemingly have nothing to do with each other, but they were two sides of the same coin. The name of that coin? Social responsibility. The draft for Viet Nam ended at the end of 1972 as the U.S. moved towards an all-volunteer army, and the war itself effectively ended in 1975. I was 16 at the time, and thereby never faced the prospect of the draft. It wasn't until 1980 that Jimmy Carter reinstated registration for the draft, a test of my own conscientious objection. As far as I was concerned, even registering for the draft was, to me, a signal to our government that I would be okay with killing people. I attended Catholic school back in those days, and the nuns at our school were actually pretty firm about that first commandment, thou shalt not kill, and didn't really carve out an exception that said that when the government tells you to do it, it's somehow okay. It turned out that I never had to confront the strength of that conviction, given that this renewed demand to register for the draft only applied to people born after January 1st, 1960, which was 2 months after I had been born. And so I grew up without the moral burden of choosing between national service and personal conscience, right around the same time that the top-tier tax responsibility also dropped from 91% to about 70%, where it remained through the 1970s. The 1980s ushered in the Reagan years, amid which we dropped the top tax rate to 50% and later 28%. Tax responsibility dropped by 2/3 over just 20 years, and it came amid simultaneous attacks on the very nature of government, as Reagan was famous for mocking. The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help. The same sentiment was echoed years later. I'm not in favor of abolishing government. I just want to shrink it down to the size where I can drown it in the bathtub. These sentiments appealed to a public from whom the government was now making fewer and fewer demands. Much as I hated the notion of becoming part of the national war machine, this lack of demand for any service among the population was also underlining an absence of responsibility. Nothing was demanded of us. Decades went by and we lost touch with the notion that our freedoms are given to us as a privilege by dint of our effort and contribution. We got out of the habit of collective effort. We as a population were collectively learning to thumb our noses at the government in an attitude best summed up as, you're not the boss of me. We didn't stop having wars. George Bush the Elder thrust us into a war against Iraq in 1990. George Bush the Younger went back for another Iraq war of choice in 2003. The first of those wars was predicated on a breakup with a former close ally, Saddam Hussein, and the second was built upon the insistence that Hussein was building up weapons of mass destruction. Not only had we farmed the job of fighting our wars out to people who saw military service as their only option for personal advancement, but our rationale substantiating the need grew ever more cynical. In the meantime, the top tax rates largely danced between 28 to 39% from both Republican and Democratic administrations. Once those folks on the top had a taste of those sub-50% taxes, we learned to ease off imposing such demands. And so, we got freedom, liberty. We shook off the shackles of responsibility toward any power larger than the individual. Meanwhile, the corporations, now imbued with all the rights of individuals by dint of corporate personhood, check here for more on that, were deemed mostly unconstrainable by law or regulation. The slightest seeming restriction of our collective freedom, even the collective access to affordable insurance through a nationwide program in which a pooled sacrifice would bring about a collective security, stirred a near revolutionary disturbance. In like manner, we resisted laws that might restrict our right to keep and bear arms. We demanded our right to drive cars that consumed fossil fuels at an unheard of rate, and those companies who drilled our freedom fuel from the ground prospered without restriction and ventured further and further into drilling from protected lands and seas. And in the ultimate expression of this freedom, even in the face of a pandemic, we were assured that any restrictions to our hard-earned, well-deserved lifestyle were far too onerous for freedom-loving Americans to obey. Shared sacrifice and collective responsibility were like the punchline to a joke, a concern for losers and suckers. This sociopathy, born in the divisions of the 1960s, was celebrated in the greed is good government demonization of the 1980s, justified in response to the terrorism of the 2000s, and exploded in the blindly ignorant science denial of this past decade. So, here we find ourselves in the midst of our own Gilded Age, one in which the top 1% of the people own more wealth than 90% of the entire nation. In climate change, we face a force which demands a global response among nearly 8 billion individuals, all of whom must relearn the lessons of personal subjection to a common goal, a consciousness of the greater collective. The shared sacrifice that enabled the defeat of Nazi Germany was partially made possible through the spirit of unionization, social security, federal programs that demonstrated the strength and effectiveness of the individual when channeled through collective action. As I said, these things tend to swing on a pendulum. Will the next swing of that pendulum bring about a renewed drive toward unionization? Will we introduce massive jobs programs focused on the infrastructure? Will we be prepared for the collective action that the great existential crisis of our current century is going to demand? We will also need to rebuild the spirit of a people who once believed in shared sacrifice. This is not a zero-sum game in which some people will win and others will lose. Climate change may look like that at first, as forest fires, hurricanes, and floodings hit some harder than others, but an unlivable planet will ultimately be unlivable to each and every one of us, and all of those who would follow. If we see this challenge as striving towards islands of survival, we will only barely put off the inevitable. We need to see ourselves as nurturing a sea of prosperity, a sea of survival. Our last best hope, rebuilding our vision of what it is to secure a meaningful life for all. In other words, securing the very notion of civilization. So, that's my take on I Finally Get Climate Change, Part 5. Please, come join me for Man Cave, a one-man sci-fi climate change tragic comedy. Sunday, April 11th on Facebook, and Monday, April 12th, 2021, at 8 p.m. on Zoom. If you're watching this video after those dates, please check in on our current schedule at timmooneyRep.com. And if this video has helped your understanding in any way, please take just a fraction of a second to tag that like button or subscribe or share it with your friends. Again, we are the Timothy Mooney Repertory Theater. Our goal is to inspire, inform, enlighten, educate, and entertain. If you're interested in helping us with that, we've got a donate button at timmooneyRep.com and a Patreon site with fun merch available to patrons at patreon.com/TimMooneyRep. See you on the stage.